so thrilled to be back here this morning. I believe I joined you all a couple of years ago before the pandemic, and I shared my story, so I'm not going to go through that whole spiel again. And then I joined you, as well as the Central Delaware UU congregation, about a year ago on Zoom to talk about some of the unfinished work of the 151st General Assembly as we were at the halfway point. And so it's wonderful to be back. I always feel like I'm home here. The Catholic Church has their Catholic schools, but I feel like UU has Montessori schools. And I went to elementary workshop, and so I feel like half of this congregation volunteered or taught there. In fact, Paul Baumbach taught me how to be a cutthroat stock trader. And that's not transferred to anything else but my card playing skills. And he and Pam just had to experience me in the Virgin Islands about 6 months ago, playing cards. So I blame you, Paul, for that cutthroat instinct, competitive instinct. I am so thrilled to be here this morning. I said I wasn't going to talk about my backstory, but I was trying to think about what to talk about. And ultimately, what I came away with is I am in a place where I want to evangelize about hope. Because I know right now that hope seems naive. Hope seems so 2008. But I'm hopeful. I got into politics because I'm hopeful. And in a little over a week, millions of people across this country will engage in what I believe to be the ultimate act of hope when they exercise their democratic right to vote. And in addition to voting, running for office is an act of hope. And as I finish my first term 2 years in, I am actually more hopeful now than I was when I first got elected. And when you get first elected, you're on a pretty big high, so it's hard to beat that. I got into politics in many ways because of my own fears. My fear that the heart of this country was simply not big enough to love someone like me, a transgender person. And I originally, when I was a kid, wanted to be an architect. And I used to read about different buildings around the world. And I stumbled across some books about the Capitol and the White House. And what I began to marvel at in reading those books was not the beauty of the buildings, but the history that occurred within their walls. Because despite the fact that no one like me had ever really made it into those buildings, let alone made it very far in those buildings, what I saw in reading that history was that the through line of those stories was the story of advocates, activists, and a handful of courageous elected officials working to right wrongs, to make impossible possible, to address injustice, and to bring in from the shadows and the margins of society people into the circle of opportunity, to deepen that understanding of we the people to include more and more people. And I found hope in that story. I found hope in the possibility for progress, in the fact that change is possible. And so when I ran, I was hopeful. But there were certainly obstacles in our way. I think a lot of people, when they heard me run for office, when they heard people like Marie Pinckney run for office, who's a new state senator, Kyle Evans Gay, when they hear people like Paul Baumbach, who's brilliant and bold, talk about the change that we need and that we deserve, they laugh it off as naive. The number of people who said, good luck with that, when I would bring up an idea. And so I was hopeful, but worried that my hope was naive. And I end this term, for as much work as we still have before us, more hopeful than ever about the possibilities for Delaware, for our state, at this critical moment in our country and our world, to fulfill what each state has as a responsibility, but what states like Delaware, I think, uniquely have as an opportunity, which is to be a last line of defense for our rights and bold laboratories of democracy for ideas that meet the scope and the scale of the challenges that we face. And throughout the 151st General Assembly, I've been able to witness change that many thought in January of 2021, when I was sworn in, would be impossible. Change that people said, good luck with that. And in the 151st, because of colleagues like Paul Baumbach, because of the state senator who represents this area, Dave Ziccola, who we were able to elect President Pro Tem of the Delaware State Senate, one of the most decent and honorable people I've ever met, let alone met in politics. We were able, that's right, you can clap for Dave Ziccola and Paul Baumbach. We were able to make change on a whole host of issues. As far too many of our neighbors were struggling to make ends meet, particularly after the economic crisis that ensued from the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to put Delaware on a path to a $15 minimum wage and to pass paid family and medical leave, the largest expansion of the social safety net in modern state history. Legislation that will provide a necessary support system for people when hard times hit, when they're welcoming a child into their family and the joys and challenges of that experience to the terror of a serious illness or a loved one facing a serious illness. We were able to grapple with some of the significant challenges that our young people are facing. Before COVID, we heard consistently that there was a mental health crisis facing young people, one that has certainly been exacerbated by the last 3 years. And we were able to finally put investments into our schools to hire school counselors, to help students get better so that they can focus on what they're there to do, which is to learn and to grow and to thrive. We were able to make historic investments into our highest needs schools. We were, in the aftermath of Uvalde, able to pass the largest gun safety package in Delaware history, including a ban on high-capacity magazines and a ban on the sale of assault weapons. And of course, as we faced and then eventually saw a Supreme Court roll back one of the most fundamental human rights in this country, the right to reproductive health care, the right to abortion care. Delaware, which had fortunately already codified into law protections under Roe, we were able to expand protections to ensure that patients and providers who got abortion care here in Delaware would not be at risk of persecution or consequences from states that chose a different path, that chose to criminalize people who got abortions or who helped people get abortions or who provided abortions. And so at this moment, a state that has long prided itself on sitting back, hoping things work out somewhere else, we decided to lead. We decided to fulfill that moniker of being the first state. Because at the end of the day, that shouldn't be a description of the past. That should be an everyday responsibility that we seek to live up to across the issues that face our community and our country. But as hopeful as I am about Delaware politics, I'll be honest, it's hard to be hopeful about the national environment. It's hard to be hopeful about a politics that seems almost so broken that it's beyond repair. And it's incredibly fitting that the book club is reading a book about difficult conversations across the political divide. Because what I was going to talk about and say today is that this is a weird thing to tell people 10 days before an election. But the only path forward is for us to seek to repair the divides in our society. To have conversations across our differences and our disagreements. I think that one of the things that I've learned in my advocacy is that all of us, I think here, are in the business of social change. We want to create change. We want to leave the world better than we found it. But to create change, you have to convince people to do something different. If everyone was already on board, it would already have happened. And in this world right now of individualized sources of information through social media, of bifurcated legacy media where we can get our information and our news from sources that conform to what we already think, in a world where we're increasingly seeing the sorting of where we live to align with our own political ideology, it becomes hard and easy and comfortable to break the bonds that exist between us and those that we disagree with. And in a world of insurrections and election deniers, it becomes easy to say they are beyond our effort. But the reality is that radical empathy, radical understanding, and upholding the inherent dignity of every person to be seen and heard requires us to say that no matter the excuses we have to cut off those bonds, it is our responsibility to try to maintain them or to repair them. Because that inherent dignity of every person to be seen and heard is a first principle. We can always find altruistic reasons to break first principles. We can always find reasons to say, you know, in most instances, this is the right thing to do, but I have a good reason to break it. But principles only matter when you uphold them when they're hard. They only matter when you have every reason to think of yourself being the hero by breaking them. And so right now, we're at a moment where we have to uphold that first principle. And that doesn't mean that we're wrong. It doesn't mean that every position they hold is right or even, frankly, worthy of serious consideration. It doesn't mean that some of the opinions they hold aren't abhorrent. But if we want to begin to heal this country, if we want to begin to have a body politic and a civic space that can work, it's necessary. I'm going to get a little comparative a little academic in my comments right now. But I was at a conference, and they were looking at why the American presidential system, the system of checks and balances and separations of power, why it worked here when in every other country, essentially, that it has been tried, that specific system of democracy, of presidential system, of separation of powers, why it's failed everywhere else. And what they found, the political scientists that looked at this question, was that the one thing that had made the American political system different than the other countries that had tried our particular kind of government was that for most of American history, our parties were ideologically heterogeneous, which means our parties had a broad range of ideas. And that meant when divided government occurred, no matter which party controlled which branch of government, the party who controlled one branch could find like-minded people in the other party that controlled the other branch of government, and government could then efficiently and effectively respond to the needs of the people, even frankly if it was things we disagreed with. But in all of these other countries, they had ideologically homogeneous parties, which meant when divided government occurred, gridlock ensued. And the government ceased being able to meet the needs of the people. And when the government ceases being able to meet the needs of the people, strong men rise. Politicians come in and say, I alone can fix it. And they consolidate power because their government had ceased to work. And the thing that made us different had been true for practically every part of American history except for two parts. I hear some of the people mumbling it. Right before the Civil War and right now. And I know that sounds really heavy, but it's real. And so the reality is that the moment we give up on trying to have conversations across the political divide is the moment we give up on our democracy. It is a necessary foundational component of our government's ability to meet the needs of the people and therefore persist. And, you know, a lot of times, right now, I think because of the pain that exists across our society, the instinct when someone's hurt is to try to prove that their pain is the worst pain around. To have their pain seen by saying, my pain is real and your pain isn't that bad. Right? And we hear that constantly. On the left, we hear oftentimes comments that seek to diminish the very real pain that exists in post-industrial communities where there hasn't been a new economic job opportunity in decades, where the opioid crisis is ravaging their communities, where the jobs and the factories and the businesses have been shuttered, where politicians never visit. Oftentimes, we literally call those areas of the country flyover country. And they say, we say to them, your pain isn't real, white men in post-industrial communities. Our pain is real as a transgender person. You don't know what transphobia is like. But then they respond, or frankly, they say in the first place, your pain, cosmopolitan elite, your pain isn't real, my pain is real. And I know that when I am hurt, when I am in pain, when I am facing some kind of injustice, the worst thing for someone to do is to tell me, even with the best intentions, it's not as bad as I think. They didn't mean it. It only makes me more frustrated, because it only makes me feel like I need to explain my pain, defend my pain, and it only pushes me more into my pain, and into my frustration, and into my anger. It only pushes me away. We know that from interpersonal relationships to large, broad civic dialogue, the first step in the path to healing is validation. Is to validate a person's pain, to see their pain. And only when they feel like they can be seen in that pain are they able to let their guard down and begin the journey to healing. And so, what I do believe is that the challenge for all of us in this moment is to strike that right balance of seeing pain without validating prejudice, but of recognizing that we have a moral responsibility and a practical obligation to see across the divide, to listen across the divide, and to recognize that justice is not a transaction. Just because you hold positions that I find abhorrent doesn't mean that you are facing a wrong that is worthy of being addressed. And the moment we begin to start to see justice as selective, as required to have proven some level of rightness and goodness, is the moment that we sow the seeds of the destruction of justice for all of us, because none of us are perfect. And so, as we move forward, as divided as it might seem right now, as fierce as I'm fighting to elect the people that I believe in this November, I truly want to challenge all of us to see that pain, to recognize that pain, to hear it, and to maintain those connections that are the only path for us to move forward from, to save our democracy, to avoid the outcomes that we saw in the only other time in American history where the divide became this stark and this pronounced. And so, with that, it can be frightening. And I go back to that point that I started on, that hope can seem naive. Because I think right now the challenge is that what I have just told you, we can't know that it'll work. What feels so destabilizing in this moment is that we don't know if we do A, B, and C that we'll reach the promised land. We don't know that it'll solve the problems. And it's sort of the first time in probably 50 or 60 years where it's really felt that way. Where the path hasn't been clear, where we haven't been able to see that light at the end of the tunnel. But the reality is that we have been burdened from the perception of history being a straight line. We have been lulled into a false sense that every previous generation knew that if they did A, B, and C, that they would succeed. And what we have to remember as you look at history, and what gives me comfort and frankly gives me hope, is that previous generations of Americans, in the most difficult of circumstances, persisted despite the fact that they could not see the light. We know that those who sat around campfires, who were enslaved in this country, Black people whose parents and grandparents had been enslaved, who in no way could have dreamed that future generations of their children and grandchildren and their children could know at least some semblance of freedom. You can't tell me that in 1830 they could see the light. They had reason for hope. But they persisted. You can't tell me that in the late 1800s, as young people were working in factories that were burning, where they were having their limbs literally cut off, with no regard for their safety and their dignity, that they could believe that things would change, that in 30 years there'd be laws that would protect them from the worst of abuses that they were facing. You can't tell me that in the height of the Great Depression, as bread lines reached around the streets, as people were having very real conversations about the end stages of democracy in this country, that people didn't have every reason to doubt that things would get better. As people who were fighting in World War II, trying to liberate a continent from tyranny, facing bullets on Omaha Beach, they couldn't see the light. John Lewis crossing that bridge in Selma, being beaten and bloodied by police. He had every reason to give up. Previous generations of Americans have had every reason to give up. But they still summoned hope. And they recognized that simple fact, that if we do persist, if we do maintain that hope, we will find the light. We will be able to bring about change that once seemed so impossible that it was incomprehensible, that we can bring it for ourselves, and if not ourselves, our children or our grandchildren. That is the story of this country. That is the story of humanity. And so if we continue to persist, if we continue to have radical empathy, if we continue to maintain our bonds with one another, and yes, recreate the bonds that we've let diminish, then I am as hopeful as ever that we will address the structural challenges our society faces, that Delaware will be able to continue to make progress, but in so doing, we'll be able to not only improve our communities, but we can change this country. I know that's heavy, but I'm hopeful, and I'm asking you to continue this fight with me. So thank you all very much. It's an honor to be with you, and it's a privilege to be with you in this fight.